Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast.
Welcome back, everybody. In today's episode, we want to talk about rent control. And particularly, Jonathan and I want to go through the intellectual exercise of trying to find the best possible reasons for why rent control could make sense. Because right now there's a mayoral election going on in New York City, and one of the candidates has promised that rent control will solve a lot of problems. And so, of course, most economists today, Jonathan, I think is fair to say, would say that rent control, that's an extraordinarily bad idea and will not solve the problems that it pretends to solve. But what we want to do today is steelman the argument rather than strawman the argument and try to see what the best arguments in favor of it we could find. But maybe we should first give a little more context about what we historically know about rent control and maybe why economists have come to the conclusion that it's such a bad idea.
Well, Jules, it's true. There are very, very few economists in the world that would argue for rent control. But I don't think we should use that as an argument why we shouldn't have rent control. Because as we both know, many times, lots and lots of people think one thing is true and it turns out later it was false. I think the reason why we should not have rent control is there are very strong arguments why it doesn't make any sense. And I think that today we should just go through them so our listeners can understand what the problem with rent control is. And I think the place to start is an old article written in the late 40s by Milton Friedman and George Stigler. What this article did was compare the housing shortage in Chicago after the war to the housing shortage in San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. As you know, half the housing stock of San Francisco was destroyed by the 1906 earthquake. Except the point of the article was there was no housing shortage in San Francisco after the earthquake. And there was a very big housing shortage in Chicago. And you have to look at this and scratch your head because no housing was destroyed in Chicago and half the housing was destroyed in San Francisco. So why was there a housing shortage in Chicago and no housing shortage in San Francisco? And the answer, of course, was there was rent control in Chicago and there was an open free market in San Francisco. And what the article does is show the classified ads for housing in San Francisco shortly after the earthquake. So there was no problem renting an apartment in San Francisco after the earthquake.
No, and so let's try to understand better why that is happening, right? So first of all, when you keep prices artificially down, what that will do is it will increase the demand for housing. And now maybe some of our listeners are thinking, what do you mean it will increase the demand for housing? Doesn't everybody need a house? And if not everybody gets a house, isn't that what a housing shortage is? But of course, people have choices when they make their housing choices, and people can choose to live together in apartments. People can choose to rent out rooms in their houses and in their apartments. And so therefore, there's still a demand effect that will result from keeping the rents artificially down.
Yeah, and this is not trivial. I mean, you may think to yourselves, oh, come on, Jonathan, there are a fixed number of houses. How could people's choices, how big a house they want, possibly clear the market? Well, as that article showed, in San Francisco, even though half the housing stock was destroyed, there was no shortage because the price adjusted. And people who were in big houses suddenly realized they could make a lot of money renting rooms out. Nobody could live the way they lived prior to the earthquake. And so people who needed housing rented a much smaller space, like a room, but in the end, everybody was housed.
Now, Jonathan, some listeners might say, oh, what this is just about is that after the earthquake, the solidarity in San Francisco was so big that everybody wanted to offer each other housing. But I have to say that I don't find that very convincing of an argument, particularly not in relation to Chicago, which happened just after the war, meaning that solidarity after the war was also really much bigger. So I'm not sure that an argument like that would really explain the difference between Chicago and San Francisco.
In the article, make no qualms about it. The price of housing in San Francisco shot up It has to shoot up.
Yeah.
Okay, there's less houses. But the point is, conditional on that, did people have a place to live? Right? And the answer was yes. So people were better off than a situation where some people paid less and a lot of people had nowhere to live, which is what the situation in Chicago was. I guess this is a general point that if a market is working, there is no such thing as a shortage. A shortage can never occur in a free market. The only way you can observe a shortage is if the market isn't free.
Now, we have just talked about the demand side of what happens when you cap prices. Let's now, on top of that, talk about the supply side, right? So if you cap rents, then that has a whole lot of effects on the supply of housing. So the first one is, if you wanted to develop new units, the incentive to do so is now much lower because the price is lower. That's the first effect. But another, I think, more subtle effect is the following, Jonathan, which I think is very much related to that shrinkflation effect that people were talking about not so long ago, right? Which is, if I told you that the price of a bag of chips is capped to chip rent control, but something can still adjust, what you can just do is, why don't you just sell 20% fewer chips for the same price? Then it looks like the price didn't change, but because effectively the quantity of the good has adjusted because you just pack it in different units, you actually did increase the price per unit, even though officially it doesn't look that way. How does that manifest itself in housing? As soon as you put rent controls on, the incentives to have maintenance and to keep the housing unit of the same quality as before is now gone, and therefore maintenance will go down by a lot, and therefore the effective housing that you're offering is actually at a lower amount.
Yeah, and this is an absolutely real effect. If I artificially hold down the price of rents, then the landlord knows the tenant will never leave, because if they left, they would have to pay a lot for a new rental place. So the landlord says to the tenant, screw you, I'm not fixing anything. If you don't like the apartment, go find another apartment. And so the apartment starts degenerating, which leaves worse housing stock, not better housing stock. And of course, the second effect is, if somebody knows that if they build a new apartment, those new apartments will be subject to rent control, then you're not going to build apartments because it's not economically feasible. So the supply goes down in a very real sense. Ironically, the city in America with the worst experience of rent control is New York City. So, Jules, one last thing that I think people don't realize is the long-term effects of rent control. You know, if the price of housing is high, it means the supply is limited and the people are bidding up the price. By imposing rent control, in the long term, that problem is made much worse because people don't build sufficiently in sufficient numbers so that the supply stays low and the free market price remains high. If there was no rent control, then people would build. Often in the case of these cities with the restricted supply, it is often artificially restricted supply. Often they will have strict regulations that limits the ability of developers to tear down buildings and build bigger buildings. Certainly that's the case in San Francisco today. So part of the reason rents are so high is actual government problems. I mean, if you want to fix the problem, the best way to do it is get rid of those government regulations.
Indeed. But Jonathan, we've now given, I think, a good rundown and a good intuition for why rent control wouldn't work. But I really would like us to try to take the other side and try to understand what are the best arguments that we can find to figure out why people would think rent control is important. And let's just be realistic about how a lot of renters and how a lot of politicians feel about this situation. And so there are a couple things that we can think about. So the first one is, suppose that you felt that some redistribution needed to happen between landlords who are rich, or that's the assumption, we can debate that, and the tenants who cannot afford much housing, and therefore to do that, get that redistribution from the capital owners to the non-capital owners, between quotation marks, done, you just impose a cap on the rent. And so this is just another form of redistribution, and that's the real motivation for doing rent control. So is this an effective way of doing redistribution? That's then the question.
Yes, Jules. I mean, I think that's a very common reason for rent control, which is essentially a redistribution reason. Landlords are rich, tenants are poor, tenants can't afford to live, and we should make housing affordable. I have to say that there are many levels on which I think this argument is fallacious. The first level is I don't think it's true that landlords are rich and tenants are poor. I think that might on average be true, but there are lots of rich tenants and poor landlords. But leaving that aside, even if you wanted to distribute from rich people to poor people, why would you use rent control to do that? Why wouldn't you just tax people?
No, I completely agree with that argument, right? But maybe people feel that every possible opportunity that you have for redistribution, you should use it because there are limits to all of them. And therefore, that's the way the rent control is the best way to do it. But what I would say is in economics, we have a very large literature that wants to ask the question, if you want to tax and if you want to redistribute, you need to think very carefully what the least distortive way is of doing those taxes, whether that's on income or whether that's on wealth. And so the idea that this one is a place where in a very little distortive way we could tax, I think most of the evidence that we've seen goes against that. It's hugely distortive to try to achieve this social objective through this particular channel. And so you're definitely giving something else up, including indeed, as you just pointed out earlier, which is the long-term supply of housing. And therefore, in the long run, everybody's worse off because fewer housing units are available and everybody's quality of living in housing is worse just for this redistributive effect. Now, what about the other arguments, Jonathan, that you could put up against these standard economics arguments? And so let's look at a couple, right? So one of them is many people believe that we as economists have way too much faith in the market and the market doing its work because people say markets fail all the time. Market failures are prevalent in many different places. And so can we think of things that make the market for housing work less than it otherwise would? And let's, for example, think about search frictions and moving costs. For a particular tenant, moving from one apartment to another apartment, as well as finding a new apartment, can be a very costly activity. And so therefore, this reduces the functioning of the market and may even give some market power, as we say, to the landlord, and the landlord will exploit that market power and therefore rip off the tenant.
First of all, let's go through the assumptions. The assumption is the tenants have the search frictions and the moving costs, which I think is ludicrous. If you've ever been a landlord and you've had to search for tenants, you know there are very big costs because your apartment is sitting empty and you're missing the rent while you search for tenants. So it's not clear to me what that tenants have bigger costs than landlords. Even if we assume that, so let's assume the worst case. Let's assume that there's no costs on the landlord and all the costs on the tenant. Then obviously you get to a point where the landlord can hold up the tenant, right? And by the way, what's interesting about this is that this problem is much, much bigger for businesses. If you're leasing a space of your business and your business depends on the location, the landlord, it completely holds you up. And we don't see rent control for businesses. And the reason is contracts are written because people fully anticipate that this is going to happen. So invariably what happens is when a business leases a property, they have a very long-term lease, and more importantly, they have options on those leases. So invariably, commercial leases allow the tenant to extend the lease under predetermined terms. So in anticipation of the holdup problem, the contract solved the problem. So I don't understand if that was a real problem with residential, why we couldn't do exactly the same thing.
Although, let me just play devil's advocate, but that's what we're here for. So what if people would say, yeah, but in commercial real estate, you are dealing with sophisticated agents and lawyers and long-term planners and dynamic optimizers, but we're not really talking here about the commercial, very rational decision makers that act in the best interest of the equity holders of the firm. We're talking here about individuals that are not particularly sophisticated, for whom these contracts might be complicated and who might be less than rational, optimal decision makers. Wouldn't that give the landlords an opportunity to exploit them?
I don't think people are irrational, especially when decisions that are very important in their lives. I think people are very careful about these things. But again, let's assume the worst. So let's assume People are stupid and they don't anticipate what's going to happen, and therefore they get taken advantage of. Well, that's not enough. The next thing you have to say is the intervention will fix the problem. And I just don't see this intervention as fixing the problem. It's like when we were talking about licensing. The assumption is the government is better than the individual. Well, the government isn't fully rational either, right? Government bureaucrats invariably do many stupid things. So you have to not only assume that people are stupid, which I don't really buy, but you have to also assume the government's smarter than people. And I'm not sure I agree with either one of those arguments.
No, and I have to tell you, Jonathan, I think here I have to agree with you that one of the characteristics of the recent rise of the utopian idealists that we're seeing is that a lot of them think that the only thing, an argument that you have to make to undermine the system that we have in place is to say that the current system isn't perfect. But that is not a sufficient burden of proof. You should not only prove that the current system isn't perfect, and of course nothing is perfect, so proving that isn't actually that difficult. What you need to prove is that the solution that you have in mind and that you want to implement actually leads to something better than that suboptimal system that we had before. And I think that the famous sayings, I think, are all so relevant in the sense that democracy is a terrible system. It is just better than everything else that we have, and therefore other solutions that you would want to put in place are just going to be worse than that. And so we have to accept the fact that democracy is second best, but that doesn't mean that we have a better alternative available. Similarly, capitalism leads to all kinds of downsides, and it's definitely not a perfect system. The question is, if you wanted to replace it with something else, what would it be, and what has the historical track record be of the other things that we've tried to put in place? And so there needs to be a much stronger demand, I think, before intervention happens, that not just it's proven that the current system has a problem, but that the fix works. And I think that's a much higher bar to meet. Also in this case with rent control.
I think this is a general problem in economics right now, which is every economist alive is going to admit that markets are not perfect. They're always second best, right? But the latest thing is, if you can just point to any externality you can find, then you say, well, the market's failed. No, I don't think the market's failed, right? There are externalities in the world. We allow people to drive cars with a major externality if you happen to be a pedestrian, right?
Absolutely.
And we admit that the externality is there, and it's better for everybody to live with this externality. Same thing in markets. We can't just say there's an externality, therefore throw the market out. We also have to argue that the alternative is actually better off. It could solve the externality and destroy the problem, right? And I think in this case, the arguments for externalities, like this market power argument, it's probably correct. There probably is some market power, but there's probably on both sides. But anyway.
There's also the difference, and I think that as economists, we're particularly sensitive to this, and this is important, that qualitative arguments in this case are not enough. So if you say there's an externality, we agree there's an externality, we need to try to solve the externality. That's also, suppose we agree that we need to solve the externality. Suppose that you had to solve the externality by adjusting the price. Even if we agree that we need to do that, we're still not there, because you need to take a stance by how much you need to change the price to resolve the externality. And generally, we don't know what the prices are for things unless we have a market for them. That's the best place to figure out what the right price for something is. So how do you know what the correct price adjustment for the externality is unless we're just willing to make some assumptions about it and try something out? But as soon as you make that adjustment, how do you know that you're not overcorrecting to the extent that you're now actually in a worse place than you were before? And I think that most of the experiments where governments have intervened and set prices for things, that has not ended well in the vast majority, if not all cases.
Yeah, I mean, actually, in a strict technical sense, the fact that we're assuming tenants are not fully rational isn't really an externality. But you could think of other externalities in the real estate market. I know one argument was that, there are two kinds of tenants, and some tenants, they're called good and bad tenants, but what a bad tenant is a tenant who's very price sensitive and keeps moving. Okay, and that means that the market's dominated by these tenants, and that creates an externality for landlords in terms of trying to pick good tenants who will be in the apartment a long time versus bad tenants who keep moving. Now, my view of that is, sure, but there's a simple market solution for this, which is First of all, you can observe how often the tenant is moved. That'll provide you information. And second of all, you could write a long-term contract, right? You could say, okay, the lease is going to be a long-term lease, just like they do in commercial, and solve that problem. You don't need government intervention. So merely finding an externality is not enough to warrant throwing the market out.
Okay, Jonathan, one more thing that I think could potentially give, for behavioral reasons, the landlord a competitive advantage over the tenant, right? Which is, after you've raised your children in a particular house, the stability for the children to stay in the same house is important. And of course, that emotional attachment to the property, which the landlord isn't bothered by, right? Clearly the tenant is. And so if the landlord knows that, doesn't that give the landlord a way to exploit the tenant?
Yeah, and I think if you ask me, that's probably the strongest argument people have for rent control, that they don't like the fact that landlords can kick tenants out. And especially, I mean, we all agree it's much better for children to be in a stable place and not have to move. My view of that is we already have a mechanism to solve that problem. It's just a long-term contract, right? The landlord and the tenant can sign a long-term contract. They can sign a 20-year lease, which in Europe is very common, by the way. It's only over here that we don't have long-term leases. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, why don't we have a long-term lease? Why don't we have that option? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm assuming it's because the labor force in America has a much higher propensity to move.
For sure.
And therefore, people don't want to sign long-term leases. But that is still a contract they could sign, which is they could sign a contract which gives only one side the option, right? We can sign a contract which says the tenant can leave whenever they want, but the landlord can't kick them out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing in there that precludes that contract. And I think the reason we don't see that contract is because that would raise the price. Obviously, if the landlord has a choice between two tenants and one tenant wants that contract and the other tenant doesn't, the landlord would only take the contract if the tenant paid more. People don't want to pay that extra, and instead they want the government to give it to them for free through rent control. The problem is when you give it to free through rent control, that has a lot of other problems.
No, indeed. So in finance language is what we call as an embedded option, right? Because the renter has a choice while the landlord doesn't. And the person who buys the option needs to pay extra for that, the option premium, and that would increase the rent. Although I don't know if we did calculations, Jonathan, how much money that would boil down to, but I think that's an interesting research question to think about. So now, the last issue that we need to discuss, though, is, and I'm sure that people on the other side of the argument would point this out, right, is the following. In medicine, we have a very clear rule, which is the rule is first do no harm. And what that means is that you let the dynamic system that is the human body run free unless you have sufficient evidence that intervening works so well that it's worth intervening. That is just an agreement that we've all made with each other, that that's where the burden of proof lies. Somebody else might say, well, why does the burden of proof lie with the people that want to change things? Why doesn't the burden of proof lie with the people that want to maintain the status quo? Why don't they have to prove that the current system is better? And so I think that some of the articles that you and I have discussed, Jonathan, essentially come to the conclusion that the empirical evidence on these questions is actually quite weak, and therefore it's quite difficult to come to solid conclusions either way. Now, I do think that the examples that we gave are pretty convincing and are quite evidence in the direction of rent control isn't working. But I still think that this burden of proof question is a relevant question to ask. Should the burden of proof always lie with the person who wants to change and intervene in the system? Or should the burden of proof that the current system works lie with the person who wants to keep it the same?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm so biased in rent control because I don't see places where there isn't rent control. I just don't see dysfunctional markets. I see high prices, right? And if there's high prices, the standard response is increase the supply. And many of these places have very strict regulations. I mean, the very same people who argue for rent control argue for very strict environmental regulations. Now, the environment's important, fine. But don't believe there isn't a cost to those strict environmental regulations. And the cost means higher rents. Right? If you want to build fancy apartments that are environmentally friendly, there is a cost to that.
Absolutely.
And so ignoring that, I don't know of a single example of a place where there is a dysfunction in the market for rents that rent control would make any difference for. The dysfunction is the supply. And so if you want to fix the price, you have to increase supply. And it's not hard to do that. You just make it more friendly for developers to develop. I know the San Francisco case. And in San Francisco, I don't know what it's like now because San Francisco is in really bad shape. But when San Francisco was booming before COVID, it was something like 50% of construction costs were meaning regulation. What I mean by that is all the subsidized housing that had to be built, all the environmental regulations that had to be satisfied, all the regulations that had to be satisfied, because half the cost of construction were those costs. Well, you could dramatically reduce the cost of construction by fiat in this situation, and you could dramatically increase the supply of housing.
Now, in summary, I think, we've gone through a lot of different considerations and a lot of reasons for and against rent control. I think that on net, even though we did our best to try to steelman the argument that rent control is a good idea, and I think that there are certain arguments that actually sit, particularly for policymakers, are things that they will take seriously. I do think that all of the pros for rent control need to overcome the almost certain negative costs that rent control bring about. And so I think that it's an empirical question whether or not some of these advantages are large enough. But I do think that we do need to acknowledge that the costs of rent control are substantial, not just in the short term, but also in the long term when it comes to the long-term supply of housing. Thanks for listening to the All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. Also, be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit allelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of Stanford University's Graduate School of Business and the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. It is produced by University FM.